So here's some update on the single cam S13 coupe. Some more of the body panels got installed. This radiator has a hole in it, so I got this one from my friend Tristan. And the shift knob didn't fit because it was a 12mm bolt, and a 240SX uses a 10mm screw on the shift knob. So I filled that with JB Weld. I'm gonna drill it and tap it and install it in the car. All right, there you go. Filled, drilled, tapped, and installed. Lots of people don't like it, lots of people do like it. That's just the parts that came with the car, so it's going on. All right, so this radiator is going in here right now, and before I address the radiator, there's one thing I wanted to address, which is this. In here, there is a exhaust recirculation into the airbox. So the airbox would sit like this. There's a hose, this is a cooling tank, this is a solenoid valve, there's a stainless steel line here that runs into the exhaust header down low. This is an EGR, so it's like a double redundant system. I don't believe in EGRs because the goal is to lower the oxygen content of the air to save the environment or to increase MPG, which could easily be done by lightening up on your throttle input. In addition, I live at about 5,000 feet of elevation, so this is very unnecessary equipment where we already don't have any air to burn. So all this stuff has to come off. So what we're gonna do right now is take this cooling tank off and throw some of this stuff away and prepare myself to do the EGR delete later. Also, while I'm in here, there's an evap can. This line right here goes to the fuel tank. We're gonna cut it over near the frame where the hard line is at. This goes to the intake manifold. I'm gonna put a vacuum cap on it, and I'm throwing the charcoal canister away to free up space since we're planning on turboing this. You gotta fight for space. So this is gonna go, and later on the EGR delete will happen. This is the exhaust air recirculator taken out, charcoal canister taken out, cooling can taken out. 4 vacuum nipples were installed while deleting all that stuff. One here, behind the throttle body, and then another 4, barely visible, very hard to reach. Later on, all of this vacuum rail on the intake manifold will get deleted, but I don't have time for that today, so they're just plugged. There is an O2 sensor hole, and down there's the exhaust air recirculator hole below that. And what I have over here is I'm making a block off plug. You take the exhaust recirculator, put it in the vise, crush it, hit it with the cutoff wheel, weld it shut, and now you have a plug. There it is, crushed in the vise. So now that I have a very closed seam, I'm gonna run in here and run a weld on that. I'm popping it back in the car. So here's a car that's holding coolant, running relatively nice. Lots of free space in there. It'll be a lot nicer when it's pressure washed. And it's gonna help a lot when we're doing mock-up for turbo install, that all of that stuff is out of the way. Everything here, trash, 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 trash. It's all trash. Alrighty guys, so here is how you make temporary plugs. This is not what you do when you need a long-term solution. This is what you do when you're waiting on parts or you're planning bigger things like switching to a turbo manifold, and you need to plug up the holes so you can move the car around in the meantime. So there's our incision. Here's our vise. Open her up, crush it. Again, this is a really great way to keep the car mobile while you're working on it. As a good temporary solution. It is not a long-term fix. So there's our crush right there. Now I'm gonna run a weld across there. Alrighty guys, here's what we got. That was flux on an unground surface, very low quality weld, but it's intended to do one job for a very short amount of time, which is stop an exhaust leak while we wait for our turbo manifold. So here we go, taking our plug and popping it in the header. So there's one there and then one down low. We're gonna pop that right back in the header so that the car is not immobilized from working on it and having to stop mid-build to wait for parts. This is another thing that we want to do to decrease intake manifold and intake air temps so we can make more power later. Is there's a support brace that goes from the hot engine block up to what I want to be a cold intake manifold. They do it so they can move them around the factory easier during production without damaging anything. However, it is a severe performance loss when it's on the car and you're driving these cars hard. So here's that intake manifold brace, and I'm gonna try and just squeeze it out. And this is what that very heavy, very heat conducting brace looks like. We're getting a little weight reduction, but really making it easier to work on the car, do oil changes, reach in there, and cooling down that intake. I wanted to warn everyone about to prepare yourself when you're working on the single cam engine and you want to pull that lower intake manifold. There's a bolt down here for that coolant passage that's unreachable. You have to pull the power steering bracket right there off and pull the pump off before you can get to the bracket. And obviously pull the belt off to get to the pump. So that's an extra amount of effort that I didn't want to do. Nobody's going to want to do. It's just something you got to do. Got to knock out a few more things before I go for my parts run. So this is what it looks like with the EGR removed off of the back of the intake manifold. I got to find a plug for this. I'll potentially be tapping and plugging it, or maybe building a block off plate. Next up is pulling off VIX. So step one is to use a small flathead screwdriver to pull out this E-clip right there and pull the solenoid off of the actuator rod. That makes it so that these butterflies go to their closed position so I can actually reach the screws with the screwdriver. Next up, I had to use the torch to heat up the aluminum housing to make it expand so I could release these 30-year-old stuck-on screws. Get those screws off and pull the actuator off. The two screws are out and the actuator is off. We'll throw that in the trash pile. Next up is to remove all 8 screws and all 4 butterfly plates. That's the rod behind there. The heads on every single one of these screws is going to try and strip out on you where the screwdriver goes. So the trick I use is I hold the screwdriver up with one hand, hit the back of it with the hammer into that to help seat that screwdriver in there and crush the screw around the screwdriver. All right, so those 4 butterfly valves can hit the wall of the port, and that's what actually holds this long rod that actuates them in. There's also one screw in the middle. We'll put that back in later because it would be a source of a vacuum leak if we didn't. So with all of that out, you can pull this long rod out. So with that out, I'm gonna take it to the cutoff wheel. I'm gonna make an incision here, and then I'm gonna 2-part epoxy this post back into that hole to stop vacuum leaks. I'm gonna put that screw back in that hole to stop vacuum leaks, and we will have fully deleted VIX. With this incision made off of that rod, I can reuse this end that will get epoxied back into here. That'll get epoxied in, seal up what could have been a vacuum leak. This long rod and all 4 butterflies that went with it are now in the scrap pile. Hit the shaft with plenty of brake clean. Hit the bore with plenty of brake clean until everything is spotless. Fill that bore up with some epoxy. And then run that shaft into the bore and let the epoxy cure. So I'm preparing up some parts. I'm gonna bring these with me to the parts store so I make sure I eyeball enough hose that it'll work. My goal is to get brand new line because this is 31 years old and I don't trust it. Then to get it long enough so we can cut out these metal pieces. Less clamps, less failure points. In addition, while I'm on the fuel rail, this side here is the feed, this side here is the return. I'm gonna make an incision here and I'm gonna cut off all of this. Having that run over this fuel rail gets really hot. It's mounted directly to that intake. I want the coldest fuel possible, so we're not gonna heat it up through this extra loop. Another thing that does, it's gonna add potential fuel pressure and potential flow we're already going to be overworking whatever pumps in there, and this is very small diameter fuel line. So I will also be getting enough fuel line to come from here, from the front of the engine, over to the fuel filter. This is what it looks like with the new heater hoses installed. Incision, incision, incision. 1, 2, and that's all. Next up, I'm going to come in here. Then I'm going to grind that off, grind that off, grind that off, and grind that off. Getting a little cleaner, going for a flap wheel now. A shot of the fuel reel, super shiny. And everything that was on it has been ground off really nicely. So that should give us slightly colder fuel. That might drop temperatures at the fuel rail by as much as like 5 to 25 degrees. So I thought that white would give it a nice touch so everybody knows effort has gone into it after the car's running and driving, and they can spot where my effort has gone. It really pops hard. This plug doesn't fit in there because it's slightly oversized. I will use the flap disc to remove a little bit of material all the way around. It kind of sucks and I don't like doing it, but that's what I got to do. Then it's getting epoxied into the hole, sealing that passage off forever. So now 100% of our coolant will be directed through that heat exchanger, the heater core, or that heat exchanger, the radiator. All right, here is the block off plate that I'm making for that oil return, whatever we're gonna call this thing. I took my sheet metal cut right out of the side of the container. Now the rest of it can go in the trash. For somebody low budget working in their dad's garage, I'd recommend welding it together or epoxying it together with JB Weld. It's best to avoid that as much as possible, but if you can't avoid it, then just go for it. I would highly recommend keeping that canister in there and plugging it up. If I had less resources, that's what I would have done. And that might be the best course of action for someone else. So this here needs to get welded together or epoxied together, and then you'll use valve cover sealant, gray Permatex on the backside, and bolt it right back on the timing cover. All right, so my friends Sammy and Tom rolled over. They brought over their drift car. We'll get this. They're helping. Say what up, Tom.
Hello.
All right, so this barb was oversized and it didn't fit in the hole. So against my will, I used the flap disc to remove some material all the way around. Now it fits in this hole. In addition, I took the cutoff wheel to this barb because there was a 90 on it. So it's just a straight shot right now. So that goes in the hole. It's gonna get epoxied in there, and this barb right here is gonna get cut, squished, and welded, I think. This is a battery terminal cleaner I used to rub some of the contamination out of the inside of that bore. That way the epoxy will have a better chance of adhering. Progress shot of that barb being all welded up. If you have a better way of doing this, then comment it below. Here's the intake manifold. After a night of the epoxy curing, this over here has hardened. That's been welded, and this plug over here has hardened in there, and I don't have to worry about it going anywhere. I'm gonna clean this intake manifold out with a couple gasoline baths and reinstall it. Guys, so this is a quick glory shot before the manifold goes back on. There's our EGR delete down there where you can't see it, or you can barely see it. There's an oil feed line for the turbo. It runs around the front of the engine. Oil pressure sensor, T, oil line, heads all bare. There's a block off there for the coolant. New coolant hoses that are really streamlined. What else got blocked off? Crankcase vent system, putting it on the car. All right guys, so it's pretty late and I went for first fire up on the new setup. There was an injector O-ring that went bad. Gosh darn, it's making me sick to be in here. All that right there is fuel. Everything that's wet is fuel. There's also a little bit of oil. I'll tell you where it came from later. Injector upper O-ring number 3 went bad and I started it up like that. And it was bad. In the course of 13 to 17 seconds, I ripped about 4 gallons of gasoline out of that O-ring. So, be safe in the shop, guys. Oil change got done the other day. Right now I'm doing injector base seals and injector O-rings. These are my injectors. That's a piece of rubber. That is, and one would also go here. They're 31 years old and all of them blew out the second I put the car together. Got these at Napa. Pop the base gaskets right into the base hole.